if you're treating everyone the same, that means that you're treating people as a monolith. You're treating people as one-sided, one-dimensional, and we're not. If you really want to connect, if you really want to be inclusive, if you really want to have an environment where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued, we have to talk about treating people in a way that's conducive for them to shine.
LeMondre, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I am fantastic, and thank you for having me, Brooke.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me some of your time to come on and chat about all things life and disability. It's really going to be a fun chat. I can feel it.
Good deal.
So, the first question that I ask absolutely everybody on this podcast is, how do you refer to your disability?
How do I refer to my disability? It is simply a part of who I am. I always look at it as it is not the defining point of who I am, but it's certainly a defining point. Just like the fact that I'm African American, just like the fact that I'm an African American man born in the southern portion of the United States.
Yeah.
It certainly is not the only thing that defines LeMondre Pough, but it certainly is a part of the
Yeah.
definition. I don't see it necessarily as a negative or a positive. It is simply a part of who I am. Almost like me being incredibly sexy. It's just a part of who I am.
I love that response so much.
Well, listen, if I don't believe it, no one else will. So,
No, I 100% stand with you on that point. I feel like you always have to back yourself first, because who else is going to believe you if you can't back yourself, right?
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
like,
I agree
you've
with
got
that
to take it.
100%.
You've got to take it as it is. And so, for you with your disability, were you born disabled or did you acquire your disability? Because the difference between the two, I think, for those who are outside of the disabled community is hugely different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was actually born with spinal muscular atrophy.
Mm-hmm.
However, I did not stop walking until I was 9 years old.
Oh, okay.
So while while I was born with my disability, the truth is it's a progressive neurological disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So what ends up happening is you still evolve, you change over time
Yeah.
with it. So it's almost like straddling the line between the two.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting place to be, isn't it? Because when you are born disabled, like, you don't know any different. But then
Hmm.
if you have a degenerative, get my words right, if you have like degenerative disability, like, you're also acquiring your disability at the same time as well, because things, like you said, things change, and that means that the way you navigate your space and the world also changes, and that's different because it's not the same all the time. And that can be quite,
Right.
like, especially like being disabled in this world, like, we already know this world isn't built for us, but when your
Right.
disability is dynamic and changing, and that means that you have to be dynamic and changing, it can get quite, like, the mental load can be quite a lot.
Absolutely, it can, and I'll tell you, um, just to give you some range in terms of how things have changed. As I said, I didn't stop walking until I was 9 years
Mm-hmm.
old. Um, However, I didn't lose the ability to feed myself until I was 25.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of thing. Whereas, yeah, I knew I had a disability, and yes, it did indeed impact me, but it's still an evolution, and I'm still learning, new things
Yeah.
about how I traverse this world
Mm-hmm.
with my abilities changing, with my physical abilities changing. How do I approach the world now? You know.
Yeah, and I also love that because you yourself are learning, and so often the disabled community are expected to know everything about disability, every disability under the sun, immediately, and if you don't know the answer,
Right.
suddenly, like, you're a bad disabled person. But if you're also
Right.
coming to evolve in your disability, and, like, you don't always have the answer, that leaves a lot of room for growth as well, which can be scary, but also on the flip side can be quite fun.
Oh yeah. But I think that's life. I mean, who
Yeah.
knows all the answers in life? Whether you are a person with a disability or not, no one comes with it all figured out, and no one leaves with it all figured out. It is
Yeah.
simply a learning process that every single individual breathing, has
Mm-hmm.
to endure, has to face, has to live through. And I think that so oftentimes, because we are people with disabilities and we're not considered, quote, the norm, unquote,
Mm-hmm.
people think that there is something mystical or magical about it. When the truth is, we're human beings simply trying to traverse this beautiful thing called life with
Yeah.
questions, with challenges, with triumphs, with answers, with positives and negatives. In fact, it is the full dynamic range of the human experience.
Mm-hmm. I actually think I could listen to you talk all day. You have such a nice voice and like the way that it lilts and moves. I'm like, everything you say, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, I agree and I love this point. It's
Well,
so
I
good.
appreciate that, Brooke. Thank you so much.
Interestingly, because you were born disabled, I wonder what was your childhood experience like with disability in your life?
It was interesting because as you said earlier, you're born with your disability, so it's not like I knew anything different
Yeah.
when I was born. Um, However, society quickly points out that you're different, particularly
Mm-hmm.
when you start getting into the school age and that kind of thing. But fortunately, my mother my mother is a child, right, raised in born in the 50s and grew up in the 60s and 70s, and she was very active in terms of civil rights,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of activism. She was very, very active. And she's a single teenage mom, so my mother had me when she was 19, and she was a child that went through that period in the US where segregation was a real thing. And so she had this passion, she had this fire, she had this
Mm-hmm.
fight, and she also had the concept of when people look at difference as a negative, that others must stand up and
Yeah.
vocalize why it's not a negative, why it's simply just a part of who I am. And that's what she instilled in me. So my approach to even my own disability and difference in general um, was very much shaped through my mother's perspective. And what I meant by that was that she taught me that I had my own agency. She taught
Mm-hmm.
me that that the world wasn't going to be fair to me, not just because I was a person with a disability, but also because of the intersectionality of the fact that I'm a black man with a disability living
Mm-hmm.
in the South. So she always taught me that, I had to be the person who stood up. I had to be the person that would fight for me, who would advocate for the things that I wanted. And she proceeded to teach me that in lessons in ways that some people would have thought, oh, that was kind of, but I thank God for it. And what I mean by that is my mother would do things like she would say things like, if there's anything concerning you that you want, you need to make certain that it's right for you, because
Mm-hmm.
society is not going to do it. They'll pat you on your head, they'll tell you how cute you are, but they won't respect you as a person if you don't stand up on your own and let your
Mm-hmm.
wishes be known and forge that path for yourself. And I remember one time we had a school trip, and I was probably about 12 or 13, somewhere around there at the time. And I knew that certain things needed to be accessible for me, but I did not do the things that I was supposed to do to make certain that those things were right. And typically what kids do is they just leave it up to the adults to do it. But my
Mm-hmm.
mother again was like, "No, you have your own agency." And when it came time to go on the trip, I didn't go because I did not do what I was supposed to do. Now, could my mother have swooped in and saved the day? Yes, she could have. But what she taught me was, listen, there are consequences to your actions. And if you don't stand up, those other adults are not going to stand up for you. So you need to make sure you do this for yourself. And these were the kinds of lessons that my mother taught me. Now, understand, some people say, well, that may have been kind of rough. But I tell you what, never happened again. But it also taught me that I was truly responsible for me. And
Mm-hmm.
if there was something that was going on, I had to let my needs be known because no one else was going to do it for
There's something in that, isn't there? That it's like that tough love that actually
me.
in the short, like, and actually it's just like anything in life. If you want to do something and like it have a lasting effect, like it's painful in the short term, but in the long term, it's really beneficial for you. And
Right.
that kind of ties into that, doesn't it? And particularly as a disabled person, you're so right in what you say, that you have to stand up for yourself. And that can be exhausting and it can be tiring, and sometimes it just doesn't feel fair. But you're
Right.
right, because who else is going to stand up for you if you can't stand up for yourself? And I don't mean that in like a physical sense, because not every disabled
Absolutely.
person can stand up, but you're right,
Right.
you have to be able to have that ability to recognize when you need something or you want something, to say it yourself, because it's all good and well having people around you, but unless you vocalize it, you can't they can't help you if you can't help yourself.
Right. And the other thing that it did for me, it showed me that my mother respected who I was. She
Yeah,
respected me because she gave me the power to say, you know what, I can choose my path. And coming with that respect also comes with responsibility. And she
yeah,
taught me that as well. So it was an incredible lesson for me, but it's one that I cherish, and I'm so thankful. I'm so
yeah.
thankful that she did that, and that was her approach. Now I know that makes her sound a little rough, but let me tell you something. She was also so nurturing and so sweet,
Hmm.
because again, I was a little kid who at the time I walked funny, I was overweight, all these things, and so when I would go to school, kids would pick at me. But when I came home, my mother would be there standing there with open arms, and she would be, "Come here, my big black baby." And she would hug me and love me. She made me feel being big and black and wobbly was the best thing in the world. So
Yeah,
for me, what it did was, no matter what they said at school, no matter what they said outside on the playground, my home base was that I was amazing
yeah,
and that I had something to offer and somebody loved it,
yeah.
you
And I
know.
think
So
that is so important for disabled people, like having that really strong home base, because let's be really honest, when it comes to disabilities, people find it very difficult. And if you're not like
mhm.
palatable as a disabled person, then you're suddenly like an angry disabled person, an ugly disabled
Oh
person,
yeah.
or just a pain in the butt. And like,
Yeah.
so that having that home, that like safe, nurturing like space is so vital for a disabled person.
Right. Having some place that nurtures you, because it may not be home. It
Yeah.
may not be, a traditional setup, but having a place that pours into you, having a space of solace, something that allows you to get replenished to take on the next day. Some
Hmm.
place of some place of warmth and comfort. I think
Yeah.
everyone needs that, particularly if you're a person with a disability.
Yeah. I'd love to talk to you about the educational experiences that you had, because from doing this podcast, I've been doing this for like a good couple of years now. And particularly in the UK, what I have come to realize, and already knew, but has only been reaffirmed by what people have said, is that the scholastic system isn't really set up for children who are disabled. And that
Mhm.
is like access, access needs, extra needs that aren't really extra because they're human needs. Even the buildings are never really set up for disabled children. And quite often you're either completely swaddled in cotton wool and protected from everything under the sun, or you're a
Right.
health and safety hazard and you're just a bit too much. And I was wondering, considering you're in America and you went through the American school system, which is different to the UK, what was that experience like?
It was interesting. It was a challenge. It was a real challenge,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll tell you why. So initially, I went to a school that was designed for students with disabilities because I needed physical therapy every single day.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to a school that was nothing but students with disabilities. But when I was 13, I recognized, or actually it was before I was 13, I realized that my older sister, who is only 18 months older than I am, that scholastically, she was so much further ahead than I was,
Mm-hmm.
like so much further ahead. Like she did projects and like science projects and history projects, and we didn't do any of those things at the school that I was at. But here's the kicker: when she would come home, I would help her do her projects. I would help her do all of her projects, and she always got an A. Always
Yeah.
got an A. And I wanted to do projects. I wanted to be challenged academically in
Mhm.
those ways. And I know that sounds funny to say, but that's the kid that I was. I wanted to learn more. I wanted to see more. And so, again, based on how my mother helped me understand that, I set up a meeting and we did what is called mainstreaming. This is when they take a student who has a disability and put them into the traditional standard public school
Yeah.
system. And so I orchestrated that. And at 13, I was mainstreamed into a regular public school system. Now, what's interesting about this mainstreaming, this is when it really became a thing. So I was like one of the first, I'm not the first, but I was amongst that first large group of students who were
Yeah.
mainstreamed into regular public school systems. And it was absolutely culture shock for me. I
Yeah.
went from, being a child who was amongst a bunch of other children with disabilities to where I was the only child in the school with a visible disability that you can
Mhm.
look and see and say, hey, that's a person uh, with a disability. And it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. I experienced that initial wanting to coddle and protect and cover. So I was in supported classes, but basically remedial classes. But scholastically, I could do so much more. I could.
Mhm.
And because the school wasn't really designed to be accessible, everything was okay, I gotta go around this way in order to get to the gym. I have to go that way in order to get to the playground or the play field that we had here. And so my nickname, my nickname is Bubba. All right. And so all of my friends call me Bubba. I know I don't look like a traditional Bubba, but all of my friends call me Bubba. And at that point, I was Bubba the boy in the wheelchair. Um,
That's a
and that,
mouthful for a nickname.
yeah, 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 yeah. Well, I mean, but that's how people saw me. They saw me as Bubba the boy in
Yeah.
the wheelchair until
Mhm.
until until in chorus class. Um, I growing up, I was always into music. I sang and I played and all that kind of stuff. And one day in chorus class, the chorus teacher asked, "Who knows where middle C is on the piano?" So I raised my hand. She was like, "Great, go over to the piano." So I went over to the piano, and she wanted me to run the scales because we were trying to find out what everybody's voice part was in the
Mhm.
class. And so I played the scales for every single student in the class, right? So found out everybody's voice parts. She said, "Okay, it's your turn." So I ran the scales and I started singing. And when I sang, I saw the girls perk up in the classroom. I was like, "Okay, this is all right. Okay." Long story short, after chorus class, a group of girls surrounded me and they was like, "We heard you could sing. Sing something for me." And so I started singing the song. And at the time, this is dating myself, but at the time, Bobby Brown had just left New Edition and he had a song out called I Need a Girlfriend. And I started singing Bobby Brown's I Need a Girlfriend. But as I'm singing, the crowd grew. All right. And of
Mhm.
course, more girls came over. Now, if the girls go someplace, who's coming next? The boys, because they're following the girls. That day on that playground, I went from being Bubba the boy in the wheelchair to Bubba the boy who could sing.
Mhm.
And so really those kinds of things really kind of defined my educational experience. Yes, there were
Yeah.
challenges. Yes, there were fights, but there were also a lot of triumphs. There was also a lot of coming out kind of moments that really defined, how I saw myself. I often say that the arts gave me my voice. I'm a speaker, a speaker and
Mhm.
a CEO of Billion Strong and all that stuff. Those things would not have been possible, I don't believe, without the arts and me being able to express that part of myself. That's why I say the arts gave me my voice because it helped me find a confidence that I didn't have before. Now, one of the challenges, though, was that even though I was mainstreamed into a regular public school system, there was still the mentality of keeping all of the students with disabilities together.
Mhm.
And the very next year, I went to high school, and I had a very dear friend who we went to the same school in terms of the school that was for students with disabilities. And it was in our IEPs. And the IEPs are individual educational plans that students who
Mhm.
have disabilities have, right? And during my IEP, it's an annual meeting. During my IEP, the counselors and those who are supposed to be in the know told me and my mom sitting at the table, well, this will be my friend. I'm not going to say her name, but my friend's first year in a regular public school system. And they think it would be better for her and for me if we just took all of the same classes. Now, here's the issue. My friend, um, at the time was listed as severely learning disabled. I wasn't. So
Mhm.
how could we survive in the same class? We couldn't. But they were
Mhm.
hell bent on thwarting or slowing down my educational process to make it more comfortable for this other student. And thank God
Mhm.
again, my mother, my advocate, my rock, she was like, you know what, we love this child. She's a wonderful person, but we're gonna put her over here. This is about Bubba. This is about LeMondre. And so let's
Mhm.
focus on that. So my mother had to advocate, even for me just to be seen as an individual versus being seen as a massive disability. And so these are
Mhm.
the kinds of things that we had to fight through
Yeah.
school.
It's always so interesting hearing disabled people talk about their scholastic experience because you're right, a lot of people have like semi-defining moments where they realize that that's when they realize that they were disabled is when they first stepped on the playground and they realize that they look different to everyone else, or like you, they have a moment where they find something that they really love and they're really good at, like as you said, the arts or what gave you your voice. And I love hearing about it because everybody's journey is different. But equally, it also just reinforces the idea to me, mainly, that actually our scholastic system really isn't set up for disabled kids, like
Right.
regardless, because as you said, like you were being put with somebody else who was learning disabled and you're not learning disabled, and the two just would never have mixed. And you're right, your scholastic progress would have slowed down just to keep you guys as a mass together rather than actually taking the time to get to know you as individuals and building on what you were good at there and then. And
Right.
that, for me, just highlights why we do what we do, because we're not always given the same opportunities as everybody else as kids. Because you're
Right.
right, people want to lump us together to just make it easier for them, or and that's where that like angry disabled person kind of comes in, that trope that we
Hmm.
have, because obviously people just think we like to scream and shout about, inclusivity and equity and inclusion, and actually there's
Right.
a real reason as to why we do it. And quite often it's because we've had these experiences where we have quite literally been excluded and a pen has been put around us to separate us from the rest of society.
Right.
But I was wondering, with your career choices and uni or like college for you, how did that all kind of meld together and then lead you on the path that you're on now?
Yeah. I have I've always loved communicating. I've always
Mhm.
loved sharing ideas, and again, this is from a child. And so after high school I went on to Midlands Technical College, which is a college here um, in Columbia, South Carolina, in the US. And there, that's when I really became more active in terms of extracurricular activities outside of
Mhm.
music. um, I was a part of the student government there. I led the student government there for a couple of years. And I really became politically active. I often say when I turned 18, I experienced severe culture shock in terms of political activism because, I came from a world um, where I understood that I had my own agency, but there was no one within my home or within my immediate family that erected barriers for me. But when
Mhm.
I really got out into society and started doing things, I realized there are barriers everywhere. They seem to be intentional and
Mhm.
easily moved, or not so easily moved. But that's when I really became active then. So all through
Mhm.
college, I was a rebel rouser pretty much. I was the guy that would have been at the protest. I was a guy that marched on the State House. I was the guy that,
Mm.
that was holding up picket signs out in front of the electric company, because the electric company also ran our transportation system. So all of these things. And so I really became politically active during the college years. And then a newly formed organization was called DAC, the Disability Action Center. It was the Center for Independent Living, and it was South Carolina's first. And so I was one of the first people to volunteer with it, and eventually it became my first job, and really helped to shape the view of independent living for people with disabilities in the state of South Carolina from
Mm.
that. So that was kind of my evolution through all of it. But then something happened after years of being at the Disability Action Center, which is still alive today. It's now called Able South Carolina. They are a wonderful organization that's really impacting um, disability rights and independent living, honestly, throughout the U.S. But very, very progressive and wonderful organization. But something happened, and I realized that some of the same things that I was teaching people with disabilities, some of the same things that we had focused on disabilities, were the same needs that other people had as well, people without disabilities. And I wanted to expand beyond that, because this is something that I realized. I realize oftentimes we're siloed off into our own little special corner as a community, when
Mhm.
the truth is, if you look at the population, according to the World Health Organization, there's 1.3 billion people on the planet with some form of disability. Well, that's not a number that you can silo off when you consider there's only 8 billion people on the planet. A
Yeah.
billion of 8, or almost a billion and a half, and some even say up to 2 billion people on the
Mhm.
planet. That's not a siloing group. You can't do
No.
that. And so often, not only does society silo us, we silo ourselves. And I had this yearning of reaching out into the community, because, as I said, I'm more than a diagnosis of disability. I'm more than a label. What does that mean in terms of how it impacts our lives and how we interact with society? And you see, I'm of the belief that if we want to exact change, that we need to be at those tables.
Mhm.
In other words, I can't just sit at a disability table. I need
Yeah.
to sit at the table of industry. I need to sit at the table of government. I need to sit at the table of policymakers. I need to sit in tables with leaders that are actually impacting the world. You know the
Mhm.
saying of be the change that you want to see? Yeah, well, if you want to be the change that you want to see, you need to be in the room when the change is happening.
Yeah.
You need to be there. And so it was important for me that we reached out beyond the disability community and started looking at the whole of who we are and showing up in those spaces as well.
Yeah.
It would be like me saying, I'm a musician, but I don't ever want to touch an instrument, or I'm afraid of bands, or I'm afraid of performing, or I'm afraid of studios. It doesn't make any sense. So my goal then was to not only, um, as they say, in the spirit of the ADA, to integrate people with disabilities into mainstream society. Well, the truth is, if you're talking about 1.5 billion people, I am mainstream society. What we need to
Yeah.
do is we need to disseminate, or dismantle these barriers that have been placed in front of us so that we can fully participate. And
Mhm.
so that's the approach that I started taking from that.
Yeah. I love that about being in the room where the change is happening, because I think there's so much to be said in, you're right, being the change that you want to see. That is really important. But when it comes to things, particularly like politics and policy making and government and how it all works, you kind of need to be in those spaces to be able to affect changes. It's all good and well screaming and shouting about it, but if you're not in the room when it's happening, then actually like it's falling on the wrong ears. And
Right.
actually, is there going to be that much change if you're shouting at a building when the doors and windows are closed?
Right.
Or is there going to be change when you're shouting inside the building where it can be at least a bit of an echo chamber? And that is a really important way of looking at DE and I.
Yes.
And particularly, I always like to talk about equity because I think people get really confused about the equity part of DE and I. And I was
Hmm.
wondering if you could actually talk a little bit about the equity part, because equality and equity are very, very different. And how
Yes.
everybody goes about explaining it is also different. And I wonder if you could do like a little explanation as to what it is.
Absolutely. So when we talk about equity, it's not about treating everybody the same, okay? And that's one of the first things that people
Mm-hmm.
have this concept of. And I've heard it a million times. I treat everybody the same. I just treat everybody the same. That's the way we can move
Yeah.
forward. Well, the truth is, if you're treating everyone the same, that means that you're treating people as a monolith. You're treating people as one sided, one dimensional, and we're not. So
Mm-hmm.
if you really want, if you really want to connect, if you really want to be inclusive, if you really want to have an environment where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued, we have to talk about treating people in a way that's conducive for them to shine.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what equity is, or that's what being equitable is. And I'm traditionally talking about in a workplace environment or either in social settings, that it's not about figuring out how I can go on easy mode and treat everyone the same way or give everybody the same thing or expect people to be able to produce the same thing. It really is about how can I get the best out of this person by giving the best to this person. And what I
Mm-hmm.
mean by that is on what plane can we connect? What
Yeah.
plane can we recognize difference and leverage that difference to move us forward? So really
Mm-hmm.
for me, equity is about finding the best way to leverage the differences that we all bring to the table. I mean, we and I think everybody has seen that meme where it's people trying to watch a game over a
Yeah.
fence, and everybody's got a block, but the blocks are different sides. So if you just stick are the same size, so if you just stick the same box under everybody, it's not going to help everybody. Some people don't need it at all, while others need three. And then you flip it, they show the photo again, and they show that the tall person doesn't have a box. They don't need a box. But then the medium height person has one box. But then the really short stature person has two boxes. And now everyone can see the game over the fence. So I think that is the difference in it. Like I said, I know it's almost cliche seeing that photo or seeing that picture again, but it still illustrates the point. And I hope that what I explained in terms of finding ways to get the best out of people by giving the best to people, and what I mean by the best is the best for them in order
Mm-hmm.
to be able to contribute. I hope that illustrates the point.
Yeah, no, it does for sure. And I love that. I love that illustration because I think it's so impactful in such a in actually a really low scale way, because it's something that the vast majority of people can grapple with, and they can understand what the picture is trying to depict. And
Right,
I think we're also obsessed with this idea that equality means everybody gets the same and therefore everything is good and everything works out right. And actually that's not quite how it works. And particularly with there being so many intersections with disability as well, it's not just like one size fits all for all
right,
disability. And so like we've got to think about the individual differences, and I'm consistently saying that disability is so individual to the individual person, and
oh,
it
it
is.
is.
But what you said about giving the best to someone, I think was really quite a key point, because we don't ever really hear from how we can give to other people when it comes to equity. Like you have to be able to give the best to that person. But then what you said was the best for them, not the best for you, the best for them. And
Yes,
that is such a valuable piece of information, that giving someone the best that they need, but the best for them, is so important because it completely removes like your, I don't want to say agency because agency is not the right word, but it almost takes away that hero complex that people have surrounding disability. It's not about
Right,
you, it's about them and providing them with the best that they can have so that they can be the best
right,
that they can be.
right, right. I think I think that is I think that is so important. I also think it's important for us to have these kinds of conversation right now
Mm-hmm.
as it relates to DEI. As you know, there have been some very powerful people saying some very disparaging things about DEI.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and but the truth is, I don't believe that there has been enough of us that have pushed back against
Mm-hmm.
that. And unfortunately, it's a very politicized season right now. So things are being very political. We need to keep singing the songs. We still need to keep promoting DEI in ways that people really begin to understand it, because this is the work that I do every single day. Every single
Mm-hmm.
day, this is the work that I'm involved in. And what I've seen is I've even seen some of those who are supposed to be on our side of this equation not only not saying anything when these disparaging things are being brought up, but also almost agreeing with some of it. And my problem with that is we are going to lose ground if we don't approach this with a sense of urgency. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, a major part of my time now is promoting the general principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and showing how it has benefited us, not just in representation, but I mean in terms of innovation, in terms of productivity, in terms of just simply elevating society. We cannot afford to lose ground in this now. And I think that it has to be a concerted effort across the board, across intersectionalities, and across different marginalized groups. And not only
Yeah.
marginalized groups, but also groups who are depicted as mainstream and majority. We need to be singing those songs. We need to be putting that information out there more than ever.
Yeah. Sandy Roberts, who is a formidable woman here in the UK, once said to me that without disability, there's no ingenuity. And ever since she said it, I just can't unhear it. And I quote that all the time and I always reference her
Absolutely.
because it was one of the best things that I've ever heard in my life. And actually, it's so true because without disability, there is no reason to look at things differently. And that's
Hmm.
not taking away from other intersectionalities and that's not taking away from other minorities. But when we think about how creative disabled people have to be consistently and on the daily, and actually it does become a second nature part of your life,
Hmm.
the fact that we don't take that into account, and I'm talking very much more about the workplace, necessarily not
Right.
necessarily talking about society, but when we're thinking about the workplace and how we don't think about that creativity as super empowerful, that's not even right word, is it?
I like it
Well,
though.
I'm
And
really
powerful. I like that.
and powerful. Like I think, well, we'll ride with it. We'll call it a word. If it's not, the Oxford English Dictionary will ring me up, and I'll get a definition together. So it is, but it is. We have to think about how much creativity there is, and the fact that it is such an untapped resource, right? Because
Hmm.
disabled people, if you put disabled people all in a room together and gave them some of like the world's biggest problems, I guarantee you they'd be able to solve them in like 2 hours without a
Oh
shadow
yeah.
of a doubt.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. But but there is something that I am seeing that it really is encouraging. I am seeing people now looking more at lived experience as real
Mm-hmm.
experience, and experience that is useful. And a few years ago we never heard people talking about that. But now I'm hearing
Yeah.
people talking about that. So I do believe that there are a lot of good things happening, but I also believe that we really have to shore up and make certain again that we're in the rooms, that is not a
Mm-hmm.
siloed room, and that not only not only do we need to ask people to show up for us when issues come up that they may not necessarily be impacted by, we need to show up for other groups as well that we are not necessarily a part of. Um, and I'll just give you a prime example. So, I'm heterosexual male, have been heterosexual male all my life, um, cisgender. So I was born like this. But I
Mm-hmm.
think it's vitally important that I show up in other communities as well, fighting for their rights, fighting for the rights of no, I'm not necessarily impacted by this. But guess what? I know that as a man, as a cisgender man, that I have certain privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And having privilege is not a bad thing. It isn't. It is not a
Yeah.
bad thing. It's all about what we do with that privilege that makes the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
at 18, 18, 19, 20, 21, somewhere around there, I'm at the State House speaking um, about, discrimination against people who are part of the LGBTQ community. And specifically what I was talking about was I was talking about hate crimes
Mm-hmm.
against that community. Was I impacted by it? No. But I also knew that there was a certain privilege that I had that I could lend my voice to that fight just so that people won't be abused. And see, I
Yeah.
think it's important that we do that. I think it's important that we show up not only as allies but as accomplices. And
Mm.
I'm not necessarily telling you what fight to pick, but I'm saying you need to fight for
Yeah.
something other than yourself.
Yeah.
You know,
Because there's that, it's an age old adage, isn't it, that if you don't stand for anything, you're going to fall for absolutely everything.
absolutely, absolutely.
And
And the other piece of it just doesn't have to be for you. You stand.
yeah,
We if we're talking community, if we're talking about real society, we got to realize there's other people involved in this, and those other people may not look like, think like, or act like you, but they're worth fighting for as well.
yeah. I love something that you said, and it was about not just being an ally, also being an accomplice. And I was
Absolutely.
wondering if you could just explain that a little bit more, because it's the first time I've ever heard that point explained in that way,
Well,
and I love it.
when we talk about allyship, we're talking about people who are supportive. We're talking about people who have a certain level of empathy and understanding and are willing to stand with you in many
Mm,
cases. But see, I like the next level of it. I like accomplices. I like people who are willing to roll up the sleeve, people who are willing to
yeah,
get in the trenches with you. Put it to you this way, in terms of, and this is probably terrible for me to do, but hey, I'm gonna do it anyway. In terms of in terms of a crime, if I committed a crime, I could have a friend, and my friend won't be charged at all. But if my friend was an accomplice to that crime, we both going down. That is the
yeah,
difference with allyship. In other words, when I have an accomplice, when I really have an accomplice, this is someone who's really in the trenches with me. This is someone who's willing to risk a part of that with me. That person is really in there. So it's not just that we support you and it's nice that you're doing this.
yeah.
No. These are folks who are real, they pull up. They pull
Hmm.
up. They're there with you, and that's the fundamental difference with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I really like that point. I think whenever I now see a post about allyship, I might be like, but are you an accomplice?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we need both. We need both. We
Hmm.
we we we, we need allies, but we also need accomplices. We need people who will bleed with us. We need
Yeah,
people who will
yeah,
celebrate with us.
yeah. I was wondering if we could go on to talk about Billion Strong
Absolutely.
and what it is and how you came to create this idea of what it is, because I actually think it's such a beautiful idea. And I'd love it if you could talk about it because it's like your baby, like Disabled and Proud is my baby, Billion
Right.
Strong is your baby.
Absolutely. Well, Billion Strong is really an identity organization. It's a global identity organization that we founded back in April of 2021. And the whole concept about it is there are a lot of organizations out there that are doing great work in terms of people with disabilities, in terms of the community.
Mm.
Um, but there was no one really doing any real work on a global level um, surrounding identity. And so it wasn't just me. I mean, there were multiple people. There's Deborah Rue, Richard Strites, Dave Perez, Nabil. I mean, it's a group of us who founded this organization, and most of these people are real giants in the disability community and well known throughout the community. But we realized that there was a void, and initially, it started with a conversation about how there are a lot of organizations out there that are looking to hire people with disabilities, but the question was, would the community be ready? And so we started
Mhm.
looking at it, and then it evolved as we started advancing through what the needs of the community were into an identity organization. And the goal of our community is to unite the global community of people with disabilities, to elevate and to empower the global community of people with disabilities. Um, and it's amazing. We often talk about the good work that's being done. A part of our job is to be an amplifier for those organizations who are doing good work. So our thing is not to compete with people. Our thing is not to duplicate what other people are doing, but to amplify and bring those voices together. Could you imagine? And I'm just still sticking with the conservative number of 1.3 billion. Could you imagine the power that we could derive if we began speaking with a united voice? Could
Yeah.
you imagine what we could move in the world in terms of
Mhm.
1.3 billion people coming together?
Yeah.
Well, that's the
It's a lot of
ambition of Billion
people.
Strong. Yeah, that's the ambition of Billion Strong. It really is. And we've been doing some incredible work with very little money, but we've been able to get some things done. And we're evolving, we're changing, we're growing, and we're continuing the work that we set out to do.
Yeah. I love that idea that as a collective of people, 1.3 billion, and like you said, that's a conservative number because when you think about people who don't classify their disabilities or don't even see themselves as disabled, like ballpark figure, let's call it 2 billion,
Yep.
how much power could be shifted and changed for the better if
Right.
everybody united and came together. And I think that that is a really key and powerful takeaway because, you know, for so long and so often, and particularly like in America, because I think of the ugly laws, because that's something that always really sticks in my mind when we're thinking about disability and keeping it in the dark. For so long, that like 2 billion people did not have a voice and they didn't have an ability to share their voice.
Right.
And imagine what it would be like if that voice started speaking, and then what would it look like if it started shouting, and then what would it look like
Right.
if it started screaming, but also what would it look like if it started singing in harmony? Like there's, you know,
Absolutely.
there are different levels, but that would be one of the most incredible things probably in existence, because the noise would be heard because you can't not hear 2 billion people.
Right. Right. I love the harmony piece of it. I love the harmony
Yeah.
piece of it. And let me tell you why I love what you said about that. First of all, again, we are not a monolith as a community of people with disabilities.
Yeah.
We have different concepts, different feelings, different, all of those things. But the most harmony itself is based on difference. It
Hmm.
is different notes that come together that just work. And sometimes the most beautiful harmonies come together by notes that shouldn't work, but they do.
Mm.
And this is how I see our movement. Because I believe
Yeah.
Billion Strong is a movement. I see us being an amplifier for those people in different parts of the world, those groups that are really doing the good work that people might not know about. I want it to be where there may be someone in Sudan that's doing something amazing, but someone in France doesn't know about it. They don't think it can be done. but we bring them together and we see that they teach each other, that they show each other, and that it grows from there.
Yeah.
I want us to be that conduit where industry that is looking for information, that's looking for ways to tap into new markets. Well, we've got the market. Why do we have the market? Because it's us. This is a grassroots
Mhm.
organization. This is not something that was put together by some huge entity. This is coming from the community itself. And so there's so much potential. There's so much potential.
Yeah.
There's so much need. And honestly, a couple of things that we do need with Billion Strong, and I hope you don't uh mind me
Oh,
sharing
plug
this.
away.
Yeah. A couple of things that we need. First of all, we need you to sign up. It's free. You don't have to pay anything
Mhm.
to sign up. And the way you sign up is going to billion-strong.org. That's billion-strong.org, and sign up. The other thing is consider making a donation. Because as I said, what we've been able to do so far, we've pretty much done it with zero funds. With zero funds. And we're working hard to make that happen, to get some funding in. Because if we could do this with very little funds, imagine if we were empowered by that tool,
Mhm.
of finances. You know, our again, our approach is ambitious. It's something that we recognize is a hard thing, but we're also optimistic and we believe that it's completely doable. And we want to be able to do
Yeah.
that and share that with others.
I'm going to take it back now to little you. So, LeMondre when they're younger. And through any form of hardship, I always think that if you can learn something out of it, then it's a good thing. It might not feel like a good thing, but actually in the long run there's something beneficial there. But looking back, is there a piece of advice that you would give to a younger version of yourself?
Hmm. Absolutely. One of the first things is that if anyone can impact the world, if anyone can impact their community, if anyone can impact their surroundings, it's you.
Mm-hmm.
It's you. And the reason that I say it that way is because oftentimes, especially our younger selves, we're depicted as powerless in terms of
Mm-hmm.
change. But what I realized as I've gotten older is that no, you can definitely make an impact. I do believe that anybody can make a difference and everyone should try. And I think that if there is something that you're passionate about, I think that, it is about going for it. It's about trying to make that change. I also believe, that exactly as you are, exactly who you are, that's what the world needs. The world does not need you to be a carbon copy of anybody else. The world needs your personality. The world needs your voice. The world needs your perspective. And that is valuable. It's valuable. You don't know how often, and I don't know exactly where it comes from, but so often we're made to believe that if we don't fit a specific mold, that somehow what we offer is less valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Or that if things are not perfect in the eyes of society, that you don't have any value. Well, this is something that I've come to realize. The world does not need your perfection. The world needs your presence. The
Yeah.
world needs your light. And I also think, and this will be the this will be an important piece of the puzzle. I also think that it's important to operate from your core, to operate from an
Mm-hmm.
authentic place, to operate from what guides you, with however you
Yeah.
define that. Operate from those places and don't compromise on you. Don't compromise on who you are. And the final thing is, life is short. Let's have fun with it. Let's have fun with it, you know? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That final point is like, for me, it really strikes home, because I have a tattoo on my ribs that says it's all about having fun.
Okay. All right, rib
And it's
tattoo. That had to
something,
hurt.
yeah, but I quite liked it. It felt quite nice. I enjoyed that.
Wow.
Um and
I've got friends like
the
you.
reason the reason I got it done was because my nana, that was the one thing that she would always say to me, right? So that would be her thing. And she would say, just remember, it's all about having fun. It's all about having fun. And if you're not
Yeah.
having fun and you're not enjoying it, you can leave. Like, you don't have to stay somewhere just because you're necessarily obligated to be in that space.
Right.
If you're having fun, you can stay. If you're not having fun, you can leave.
Absolutely.
Now, I understand that that works for a lot of situations, and then sometimes there are some situations where you kind of are obligated to be there, and like if it's not so fun, like a work meeting or a team call, you kind of have to stay if you want to keep your
Right.
job. So it doesn't always apply to that. But I think it's so vital when we're talking about conversations that we have, like disability or equity or diversity, because actually, like, if you come from a fun loving place, rather than this place of scolding and anger and telling someone off, your message is delivered in a very different way than it is if you are going to be angry and scolding. You know, nobody likes to be told off and nobody likes to be shouted at, but if you can
Right.
deliver a powerful message in a fun way, then actually that's far more impactful than if you scream in someone's face.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I take from it. So
I'm gonna
shout
tell
out to
you.
Queen Phil.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out. You said this is your auntie?
No, my nana.
Your nana. Okay. Now listen, I love that. And actually, for me, it goes back to that authenticity piece of it. It goes back
Yeah.
to operating from that core, because what I noticed, and this was after me doing some real work in terms of working on LeMondre. I mean, really coming to grips with
Mm-hmm.
who LeMondre is. I recognize that when I operate against my core values, my core beliefs, my core things, that's when I'm unhappy, and that's when it's not fun. And of course,
Yeah.
I'm talking about from a perspective that's, far beyond the practical in terms of business meetings and those kinds of things. But those instances, those moments where I felt disconnected, those moments where I felt less than and not confident, was when I was operating in a place that was against my core. So when I went back
Mm-hmm.
to my core, that's when I found fulfillment. When went back to my core, that's when I found purpose. When I went back to my core, my authentic self, that's when I make the greatest impact. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what I do. In the beginning of this conversation, you was talking about, me, the way I speak. Um, I'm a
Mm-hmm.
speaker. That's what I
Yeah.
was put on earth for. I believe that's how I communicate. It's about making an impact through the words that come out of my mouth, and I embrace it. I embrace it. I love it. And so it's the kind of thing that happens naturally because I'm operating from my core. I'm operating
Yeah.
from who I am, and and I love it. I love it. Anytime that I can be on stage or do a webinar or even to do this, I feel like I'm most alive. I feel like what I call this is where you can see the fingerprint of God in my life,
Uh-huh.
and uh, and I'm here for it. I'm here for it. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share in this platform, and anything else I can do in any way. Please let me know.
Oh, thank you. What's really interesting is what you call the fingerprint of God, I call the fizzy bubbles of champagne.
I love it. I love it.
So I always say that, like, my best and natural state is when I get really excited and I'm fizzing like a champagne bottle, like just before you pop it, because that's when I deliver at my best, and that's when I speak at my best, like you, or that's when I'm able to articulate quite a complex idea into something that's not as like a really, it's more accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that we have all these different names for actually what is pretty much the same feeling. So
Mm-hmm.
what your fingerprint of God is my fizzy bubbles of champagne. And like, I'm obsessed with that because I know exactly the feeling you're describing because I can feel the fizz.
Yeah. I got it. Feel the fizz. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. Whatever it is that moves you, let's ride on that. Let's bet on that. Let's go with that.
Yeah,
You know, and I'm
exactly.
telling you, it just it opened me up so much when I
Mm,
so as I said, I'm a speaker and I do some coaching, and so I have this thing where it says I have a statement that I said is live big, live full, live authentic. And that live big, live full, authentic, it's actually backwards. But what it means is when you're operating from your core, when you're operating from your core, that's when you find fulfillment. And
mhm.
when you find fulfillment, when you find the things that gives you those fizzy bubbles, when you find that, that's when you can have your greatest impact. That's the living big piece. That's when you were
Yeah,
when you impact the world. So the authentic piece of it is an inside job. The fulfillment is when you're really been working that inside job, and that live big piece is the overflow, how it impacts the rest of the world. So live big, live full, live authentic.
oh, I love that. I only have one final question for you,
Sure.
Lemondre. And I got to say, I have loved this chat because I think you've brought up so many really interesting points, and the way that you're able to speak about them is very articulate. And like I said, you're able to distill what can actually be quite complex ideas into something that's a lot more accessible and manageable. And I can only thank you for that because that will help somebody else be able to explain like a big idea that they feel is too big down to something that's a bit more bite-sized. And I think if that's one thing that you've given someone, then that's magical because then they're able to express themselves better.
Mm.
But my final question for you is, Lamondre, are you disabled and proud?
I'm like James Brown. Say it loud. I'm disabled and proud, baby.
I'm gonna like caption, get that bit and snip it, and then like put it everywhere because I think that's such a great response. Thank you so much for giving up time today to come on the podcast. I've loved listening to you talk about DE&I, about education, about Billion Strong. I think it's been really impactful. And like I said, thank you so much for giving up your time to be here today. I've loved it.
Brooke, thank you for the opportunity to share. Again, this is the fingerprint of God in my life. So thank you for allowing that fingerprint to be seen today. I appreciate you.